Hey, everybody, welcome in once again to Strictly Speaking here on True Blue. I'm Bob Frantz. Today, we've got something a little bit different for you, and it's something that I absolutely love. And we're talking about getting largely away from the politics and talking about stories and talking about people that you don't ordinarily hear about that you should hear about. Lee Habeeb is a talk radio executive. He's a talk radio host. He's a podcaster. He's an essayist and is the creator and the co-founder of the Laura Ingraham Show. I know you know that show. Vice president of content for the Salem Media Group, the founder of American Private Radio, and the creator and founder and host of Our American Stories. That's a weekday radio show syndicated across this country. Lee has also written columns for USA Today, Washington Examiner, National Review, LifeSet, and he has a weekly column in Newsweek. But it's the Our American Stories program that has grabbed our attention today, and I want you to see what this program is all about. Watch this.
From the beginning, Americans have been asking ourselves some basic questions. Who are we, and who are we to become? The answers to these questions constitute the American story. That's what we do here every single day. Tell the stories of a good and great country. Not a perfect country, but a good and a great one that aren't being told. Ours is the only country on earth birthed by an idea that all of us are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights by our Creator. And most important, that our government derives its powers from us and not the other way around. It was a revolutionary idea then. It still is. It's why millions of people come here from other countries seeking a better life. They don't come here to change America. They come here to have America change them. The stories we tell are old and new, stories from our past and present, stories of risk-taking and adventure, generosity and courage, resilience and redemption, faith and love. We tell stories about entrepreneurs and inventors, scientists and engineers, athletes and artists, coaches and teachers, military heroes and faith leaders. And we tell the story of ordinary Americans who do extraordinary things each and every day. Stories from our listeners about their lives, their history. Stories that the media doesn't cover. Stories the media doesn't think are important. We disagree. Indeed, if there's a bias that Our American Stories was designed to correct, it is the media's predisposition to cover the train wreck, to cover the bad, the loud, and the ugly, while ignoring all that's good and beautiful around us. And we do it all from our studios in Oxford, Mississippi, home to writers like Faulkner and Grisham. Elvis Presley was born an hour's drive east, B.B. King a 2-hour drive southwest. And an hour's drive due north sits Memphis, where gospel, country, and blues collided in a little studio on Union Avenue and changed the world. Our stories spring from every generation and every precinct, from our nation's prairies and shores to our biggest cities and our smallest towns, from ballparks and blues joints to summer festivals and state fairs. And every day, we tell the story of America to Americans. In that pursuit, we'll be a place where listeners can recharge and refresh their spirit and be inspired by our stories. This is the story of Our American Stories.
So who's telling those stories? Our guest today is telling those stories. The creator of Our American Stories joins us here on Strictly Speaking. Lee Habeeb, so good to have you here. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
Pleasure to be here. Feeling good. Yourself?
I'm feeling great. You know, it's weird. I didn't even watch one of the American Stories just now. We just watched that little introduction, and I'm inspired. I'm inspired by it because I love the idea of it. And I guess we'll start there. Why does everyone stare at the train wreck? Why do they ignore the good, the true, and the beautiful that you referenced?
Well, I think part of it's just human nature, right? When there is a car accident, everybody slows down. They want to see. The macabre is a part of life. The lurid is a part of life. The harder thing to do is to attract people to something beautiful and good. It's harder to make a good movie than it is to make a bad one. And you know, one of the interesting stories we did was about the making of The Godfather. We had on one of the great experts who had interviewed Coppola and the struggle it took to make The Godfather. And early on, Paramount tried to kill the movie because it had turned out that Kirk Douglas had just done a big motion picture version of a mafia movie, and it had failed, and it was this third straight failed mafia film. And so Paramount wanted to cut it. And Coppola was like, those films were bad mafia movies. Mine's a good one. So it wasn't that they were mafia movies that they failed. It was that they weren't good movies. And by the way, as we learned in that discussion about the Godfather, it wasn't actually a mafia movie. It was a family film about succession and power. So anyone who owned a family business or has had a family with interesting dynamics, remember the oldest son, Sonny, was killed. He had a hot temper and that killed him. The middle son, Fredo, was an incompetent, and every family's got the Fredo who seemingly is the next in line to run things but can't. The younger brother is forced to run the business. Everyone thought Michael would, of course, go off and be a U.S. senator and legitimize the family fortune. And he's dragged into the business. His oldest brother is murdered. He murders his middle brother for betraying the family. And in the end, if you remember, he's all alone on that bench, the victim of tribalism, which, of course, Mario Puzo, who wrote the novel, deplored and despised tribalism. He didn't like that the city-states of Italy warred. He loved America because of its e pluribus unum, that a Polish girl could meet an Italian, a Catholic could meet a Protestant, or a Jewish kid could meet a secular kid, and they could get married and live and love. And so it was really a book about family succession and a movie and about tribalism and what happens when you put family over love of neighbor, and the love of the tribe over everything else. And what was that warfare about but five families trying to run the rackets in the city of New York and warring over territory and grievances? And it doesn't work. And what's really worked in America all these years is this idea of e pluribus unum and rule of law. From the many one, and we're all given the same opportunities, and we're all supposed to be treated equally under the law. And that rule of law and a freedom of conscience and freedom of religion were the reasons so many people have come here in the past, if not all, and why so many more want to come. And this is still true as we watch the border dispute and everybody's arguing about the border. What I see, in addition to a wave of illegal immigration, is an actual testimony to the power of America. If the people who claim that this is a white supremacist nation are speaking the truth, my Lebanese grandparents and my Sicilian grandparents would disagree as loudly as all the brown people and Asians crossing the border in the South to come to America. Now, we want legal immigration. I know my grandparents did not desperately oppose illegal immigration because they waited so long to come here. They paid the price. They had to pass a test. They had to go through Ellis Island. They had to get their names changed. Habeeb was IB. It was changed to EEB. By the way, no big deal to my family. We wanted to become Americans as quickly as possible. There's a line in that video that I love because it's what my grandfather used to say when he listened to all the kids in the 60s trying to change America. And he said, we immigrants didn't come here to change America. We came here to have America change us. And by God, it did. By God, it did. I never forget those things. My grandparents have passed, but this is sort of an homage to them and to my history teaching father, who had always told me and then showed me the greatness of this country by taking me to St. Louis to see the Arch and the Lewis and Clark Trail, to take me to Gettysburg where he went to college and see the price that got paid on the battlefield for the freedom of not only our slaves, but in the end, the reunification of our country, and to take a road trip with his son all the way to Vicksburg in Mississippi so we could see all those Civil War battlefields and spend a couple of weeks of father-son time. This is something, regrettably, that too many Americans are not doing. Not only not sharing the story of their families with their children, but sharing the stories of their country. We can blame the public schools all day long for not doing this, but in the end, we're the ones who pay the taxes that fund those schools. We could be going to those school board meetings and should have years ago demanding that American history get taught and taught straight. No thumb on the scale for conservatives, no thumb on the scale for progressives, no thumb on the scales for anybody. Just tell us some straight history. But we surrendered that territory, conservatives and a lot of patriotic Americans, and then wondered what happened. Well, when you surrender a playing field, you can't blame the people who take it.
Wow, that's a heck of an intro. That's a great way to start this conversation. First of all, you hooked me on the Corleone story and what it was really all about and everything else. Now, was that one of the episodes in the? Let's go back. In fact, how many episodes or how many years have you been doing Our American Stories?
We've been doing this since 2016. We started with one affiliate, got to about 230. Premier Networks, which is the iHeart syndication unit, picked us up, and their podcasting unit. And now the show has grown to, I think, the Talkers ranked us number 11 in aggregate audience last year as a radio syndicated and streaming show. And this was proof in the end that the audience wanted to know about their country, not their republicanism or their Democrat nature, not their political instincts, but what are the stories we can agree on? I mean, why was the Constitution formed? What problem was it trying to solve? What did the founders really think about slavery? It's very complicated. What was the Three-Fifths Compromise? I mean, because people have got it all wrong what the Three-Fifths Compromise was. And so telling the stories of these real life human beings, right? George Washington didn't know it was going to happen when he looked out into Brooklyn Harbor and he saw an armada of British ships coming his way. He didn't know what was going to happen. These people weren't walking around in the past. They were walking around in their present. And the thing I hate most about the way we do history is something I call presentism. We act as if we were there then and we would have done something different that they would have done. But we weren't there. It's hard to judge people out of their times. I don't judge my 10-year-old self, for goodness sake, let alone my 20-year-old self, now that I'm in my early 60s. But my goodness, this country's old and this country's not perfect. And always we tell our stories with the best historians, with the best storytellers, whether it's Dale Earnhardt, the author of Earnhardt Nation, or our latest on the Gettysburg Address by a guy at Gettysburg College who wrote a book called The Gospel of Gettysburg. And it's the story of that day, just the day that Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, and why it took 3 months from the Battle of Gettysburg to give that address. Why did it take Lincoln 3 months? What was he up to? What were the circumstances that led to that delay? These are all fascinating stories about real life people. And without these people, we don't have the events that happen. Nothing in America that happened had to happen. It wasn't social forces. The Marxist thought is social forces happen to people. But the more conservative thought, the more libertarian or even conventional liberal thought is that people make these social changes. The Industrial Revolution didn't just happen. Henry Ford made it happen. Manufacturing capacities were developed by human beings. Steve Jobs made the iPhone. Now that catapulted massive change in society. So did the barbed wire. We're doing a story right now on the history of barbed wire from the founder of the Barbed Wire Museum in Texas. And it's fascinating.
Museum?
There's a museum, a barbed wire museum. We love doing stories from weird museums. We did one from a toaster museum.
Probably hard to get in and probably hard to get out too, I would imagine.
Harder to get out than to get in.
that's and see, now what's really weirdly is I want to talk about how you managed. I love what you said, by the way. We need to teach our history without a thumb on the scale for any ideological position. That's not how it's taught, unfortunately, but that's what you're trying to teach through these stories. You're telling the story of people, not of positions, not of ideology, but just reality, and free of politics. But even in the course of describing it, because I found that out through the show, that I've tried to make not necessarily overtly political. I want it to be just kind of like a lot of everything, but politics creeps into everything. And even in your description, you talked about, what it's like for people to come here. And then that gets into the illegal immigration issue. And all of a sudden, now everybody who hears that is going to take a side on where they stand on what is, no human being is illegal to, hey, you can't have a country without having a border. It's so impossible to keep politics out of even modern or American history, isn't it?
Well, it is, but we've been here before. There were times when we've tried to limit immigration. During the Great Depression, it was Roosevelt himself who understood that when we have no jobs, we can't have more people come in here to compete with the jobs that no one has. So immigration has always been a policy in which we, the American people, get to decide who comes in and when they come in. And this has been a dynamic feature of American life. And so not many people in America, if you were to poll it, are for outright illegal immigration. They're just not for it. And by the way, we don't take a position on that, but we've done a bunch of different immigration stories. We did an entire series on the Vietnam refugees. They came here after the Vietnam War. There's one remarkable story where we actually had a naval ship and we were pushing off some of our naval planes, which were in need of repair, so that more Vietnamese refugees could come here. Catholic Charities, it turned out, adopted thousands of these Vietnamese refugees. They scattered around the country at first, but Catholic Charities soon came to understand where the Vietnamese thrive best is where there was great fishing that resembled the fishing and the farming of their homeland. And what do you know? To this day, there's a huge and thriving Vietnamese community in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi and Alabama, where shrimping and the kinds of fishing that Vietnamese did at home, they were able to do here in the United States. And we've been telling stories of second and third generation Vietnamese families. They're now doctors and lawyers and in government positions. And it's in the end, it's a love letter to the country. And yes, they face some discrimination, but we learn that every ethnic group that came here, we do a story of the first Kennedy, Joseph Kennedy's grandmother, not John F. Kennedy's grandmother, Joseph Kennedy's family, what everybody thought was the patriarch. Well, he had grandparents. It was his grandmother who first came to America. She came as a house servant, a maid, essentially. The Irish being one of the only groups where a lot of the women came first and the men came second. The men's love of the homeland had them trapped there, almost starving to death. And the women finally said, well, we're out. We're taking our family. You stay and starve. We're going and we're feeding our kids and we'll be maids. The very first female Kennedy to come to the United States goes from maid to bar owner to property owner. But even as her own children die, and back then a lot of people lost their kids in infancy to disease and all kinds of things, and lots of miscarriages too. She wasn't able to bury her children in Boston because she was a Catholic. Protestants forbade it. So she had to drive an hour out of town to bury her babies. But this did not deter the Irish from one day running the city of Boston. In 2 generations, the Irish ran all of the major Northeast cities. We have the same stories about Jews. We're doing one right now about Martin Greenberg. He has Greenberg tailors. He's the greatest tailor in America, the tailor to presidents. And where does he learn to sew? Well, his parents were murdered in Auschwitz. And when he was 6 years old, what saved his life was his talent for fixing collars. He didn't know how to sew, but an old Jewish guy who had worked his way out of the death camps and into the labor camps taught young Martin how to sew. He came to the United States with no family, got a job at the factory, which he one day would come to own. And by the way, he suffered a lot of anti-Semitism in the United States because the United States did have plenty of it. The Jews overcame that anti-Semitism. And despite that anti-Semitism, thrived to become the highest household income class in America, now only to be usurped by Indian Americans who come, many of them with nothing from places like Mumbai, and in 1 to 2 generations are outstripping every ethnic group in American history in household income, and are now being discriminated at campuses like Harvard and MIT for the mere fault of being too good at math and science. These are remarkable stories about American resilience, American grit, and the ability of us to not only overcome prejudice individually, but how we live and love, how we intermarry, Protestants marrying Catholics, Jews marrying Gentiles. My own Lebanese family, my Lebanese family didn't want their kids marrying Italians. My Italian family didn't want their kids marrying Lebanese. And my parents said, we disagree. They got married, and within years, the Italians and the Lebanese were getting along together. We loved our way to overcoming prejudice. This happens all the time in this country. We didn't need an EEOC to fix that problem or lawsuits. Love conquered prejudice. So did hard work and resilience and grit.
Wow. Lee, you're a walking encyclopedia, it sounds like. And for our younger viewers, these are big books that used to come annotated with all kinds of information that I guess don't exist anymore because of search engines and because of Google. We actually had to look these things up before. Lee, how do you and your team at Our American Stories look this stuff up? I mean, you're bouncing from from the Corleones to the Kennedys to the Jewish kid who made collars and could fix collars to all of these different things. Where do you gather all of this information to then come to produce a new episode of Our American Stories? How do you find these things? Everybody knows the Kennedys, but nobody knows about that little Jewish kid. Nobody knows about how he learned to sew in a labor camp. Those are stories that are remarkable. Where do you get this stuff, and how do you find it?
The goal was to grow. If we grew the show enough, the word "our" in Our American Stories meant a lot to me. It was the most important word. We fought hard for the title of that show because this is our America, and it always has been our America. It's we the people. And so I wanted and continue to want the audience to send me stories, for historians who are listening to tell me about what we've missed, to fill the gaps. The wisdom of the crowds is remarkable. The experience of the crowd are remarkable. So we take listener suggestions, but we're now hardwired to so many terrific historians around the country. And moreover, they don't have to be historians with PhDs. There are people like my dad who he had a master's in history, but he would have had a master's in history without the master's. He's still reading a one piece of nonfiction a week in his 90s. And he's
Wow.
always giving me story ideas about this book or that book. He gave me the story about how NASCAR came from moonshining. And it's a wonderful story about how the moonshining industry in the South created NASCAR. And so we called up that author who spent 6 years on that writing project, and he told us one heck of a story. And so what we have is some.
Give us a taste of that. Not the moonshine, the story. Give me some of that.
Well, during there were some interesting alliances during Prohibition in the South. You see, after Prohibition, while Prohibition was reigning supreme, there were a lot of people who wanted to keep Prohibition going, particularly the moonshiners, right? Because they had an interest in moving their alcohol to all the speakeasies in the North, and all the just barn parties in the South. So what would happen is the bootleggers would have to get their booze from point A to point B, and so they would give it to young men who'd souped up their cars to outrun the state police or the local police. And so this is how it started. Ultimately, these guys on a Saturday with nothing to do, you got to remember there was a day when there wasn't the NFL, there wasn't TV, there was nothing to do. You had to cut loose and make your own fun. So these young guys, kind of renegades, would basically build a circular track in a cornfield, lower the place, put up some stands, and just drive around in circles, whacking each other, testing the tires, testing out who could get around the track the most, and of course, drinking, and even more important, gambling. And this is how NASCAR gets formed. And then the Frantz family comes in. One family owned NASCAR up until very recent history and took it from this nascent, weird little Southern activity. Remember, the South didn't have professional sports teams. I mean, it had the Atlanta Hawks late. The Atlanta Braves late. It had the New Orleans Saints. But for the most part, college football was all there was. And so what did you do with all that spare time? So NASCAR started as a Southern sport, became this massive regional sport. And on the actual day that it became a true national sport with one major cable deal, Fox, that was 2001, with one major star propelling it, a guy named Dale Earnhardt. Earnhardt dies on the track that day on the last lap of the Daytona 500. And everybody knows he's dead. I mean, I don't know if you remember, and I watched it. And when he hit that wall, there was silence in the place. And if you remember, even when his teammates won, because if you remember, Waltrip and his son were driving 1 and 2. and Earnhardt was on the last lap. That was the last lap. And Earnhardt was known as the intimidator. He was always getting on people's rears and pushing them out and scaring them. But on this day, he died being the protector. He was trying to get in the way of his team's competitors because running number one and number two were Team Earnhardt drivers. He knew he couldn't win the race, but either his son or Waltrip were going to win the race. And of course, one did. But Earnhardt took it from the backside from one of the intimidators trying to move him out of the way. That's how he died. By the way, he's the last person who's died at a NASCAR track because major innovations occurred around safety because of his death. So we start the story where it started in Prohibition. We ran it all the way to the end with Dale Earnhardt dying on the track on the biggest day in the history of NASCAR in 2000.
I remember that much, much less than you do. I'm not you're obviously an enormous NASCAR fan. I'm a football guy, baseball, but whatever. But when I saw that, I remember being blown away by the fact that it didn't seem as serious as enough to take his life. Because how many times do we see in a NASCAR race, a spectacular collision where a car will do 360s in the air and just like, oh my gosh, and the guy walks away. He just hits a wall. And I don't know what it did to his neck or whatever, and suddenly the biggest star in the sport, as you said, is dead. That shocked me when that came out that way.
It was really, when you've watched a lot of the racing, the flips don't kill the guys as much as running straight on into a wall. And it was straight on. That was the problem. That rarely happens. There'll be bumps, there'll be wedges, there'll be flips. They're strapped in. The fires generally don't kill the guys because they have the flame retardant suits.
Right.
Fire trucks are there. So you start to get to see a number of kinds and types of accidents. When that one happened, the speed at which he hit that wall, straight on. I mean, it was a dead perpendicular hit.
Did he break his neck? I mean, I literally don't know.
It snapped his.
You mentioned. Yeah, because you mentioned it led to a whole bunch of new safety measures, and wasn't one of them some kind of a new neck restraint?
Exactly right. And for Formula One, too. So it saved a lot of lives in motorsports of all kinds. But what a tragic way to end life, that traditional kiss on his wife's cheek that he gave every time, and the wife always wondering which race might it be. And that was the last race. So what we do is we sort of get out of the way of these stories, and we let the historians speak. Then we go into the editing suites, and we'll start off, and we'll have these pauses. There's musical breaks. We treat it as if it was a TV show with a score, but without the pictures. And then we play theater of the mind, and we've had some very generous donors, and now our audience is donating because they love what we do, and we're a nonprofit. And I listened to NPR for a long time and thought, I don't like the political nature of much of their content, but my goodness, is it beautifully designed and is it beautifully produced? And in talk radio, it's generally just a caller, a call screener, and it's great. I mean, I've spent my life in talk radio, but I thought, why don't we do something different here? And why don't we tell stories and only stories? Having an opinion in our shows is a fireable offense. That goes for the authors. That goes for anyone else. We have enough opinions on the planet. Another opinion's about as needed as another enema. Except enemas are necessary sometimes. All right.
Of course, the only place where I guess your opinions would have to be inserted is in the selection of the stories. Right?
Well, the curation is where it matters. But even there, I don't care where you stand on unions. It doesn't matter to me. The union movement was an important movement in the early 20th century. And to not do the union movement is not to cover American history. The suffragette movement was a big movement. It was filled with a lot of people who don't have politics that I have or would have had then. But thank goodness, right? Thank goodness. So all these divergent and convergent things that happen in our country, in large measure, happen from people of all different perspectives who've had all kinds of contributions to this place we call America. And we try to keep our thumb off the scale there as well. We're trying to cover every epoch of American life and then every thread of American life, particularly the arts and sports, because they're businesses too. We did a story about the making of Georgia on My Mind because a friend had sent me the story and said, Lee, when you hear the story of Georgia on My Mind, you're going to want to tell it. And a white Midwestern writer named Hoagie Carmichael wrote the song. Nothing ever happened to it. It sat in a drawer. A few people covered it. He covered it, nothing happened. He went on to write like America's songbook in the early 20th century. But by the 1950s, rock and roll had come in, and all those old timers, the Irving Berlins, the Cole Porters, their music didn't have a place anymore because everybody wanted the new thing, the rock and roll, the blues. Well, what do you know? 35 years later, Ray Charles, who's stuck in what he considered the black ghetto of music, blues, R&B, Atlantic Records, wanted out of his Atlantic Records contract. What he wanted to do with his next two records for ABC was to first do a record of his favorite standards, many of which were written by white composers. The next record he wanted to make was a record paying homage and respect to country music, which he heard and loved many times and considered it an American form of blues. And so what happens is Charles records Georgia on My Mind, and he never met Hoagy Carmichael. Ray Charles grew up in Georgia. He was blind. Hoagy Carmichael was white and close to death. Through the miracles of intellectual property, which Americans have, our songwriters are so great because their intellectual property is protected. They can write a song and it's theirs, and they can sell it, and they can get royalties. Well, the recording that Ray Charles did was ranked the top 50 song of all time by Rolling Stone. Ray Charles played it to close almost every set he ever played, and he played 200 sets a year until he died. And the best part of this story is it made not only the world a better place, but it made Ray Charles and it made Hoagy Carmichael and Carmichael's estate very wealthy men. And that's a great story about art. It's a great story about commerce. It's a great story about love. And think about how white and black came together there. Nobody accused Ray Charles of culturally appropriating this white man's music. How ridiculous. Music is about sharing. Paul Simon goes to Africa, and out comes Graceland. How beautiful. How beautiful. And so we love to focus on this aspect and dimension of American life because it is, we believe, the high mark of American life. And it's tragic that the music itself has become politicized because it's such an overtly and radical political act, and I mean small p, for this to even exist the way it exists. It's a radical experiment in democratization and cross-pollination. And this music all springs from America. And by the way, so much of this music is an American invention. We didn't want to do Beethoven, so we get Rhapsody in Blue instead. We create jazz music. We create rock music. We reinvent gospel. And even our literature, Mark Twain, he didn't come from the high prose of Balzac or Dostoevsky. American writers sounded and looked and wrote about the things Americans thought about, how Americans sounded, and what would appeal to the masses, not what would appeal to a very narrow group of elites. So even our art was sort of democratic in nature because it wanted to appeal to the most number of people, the opposite of the high art of Europe.
Wow. So you've mentioned Coppola and Kennedy and Earnhardt and Ray Charles and Hoagy Carmichael, and we know all of those people. You know, I bet nobody knows? Nobody knows Walter Hunt. Throw this up here. This is the current homepage of Our American Stories right now. The inventor extraordinaire who gave us the safety pin. Tell me how you go from all of those stories that you just talked about and their extraordinary influence on American culture, and again, most of them very well-known individuals, to the inventor of the safety pin made an episode of Our American Stories.
Well, what we like to do is we've talked to a couple of people whose fame is to study the not so famous, and particularly inventions. And so, you know, think about life without a safety pin, and you might think, oh, well, how silly, but try sewing without one, right? And try, you know, for anybody who's ever tried to sew anything, try doing it without a safety pin. And so it's a.
Can you sew?
No, please. I the only thing I would do is sew a finger off if I sew. But you know, my
Same
daughter,
here.
my wife love it. My wife's mom loves it. My mom loved to sew, and
My mom did too.
and praise God, it's a great hobby for some, and it's a vocation for others, and it's a way to make a living for some of the greats. And so we love this story. We did one on the elevator brake. Because the elevator brake allowed the elevator to exist. It was a man named Otis who created it. And it changed the way we live the elevator brake because it allowed us to go over 3 stories and up to 90 and 100 stories. In fact, there's this remarkable scene where Otis is at the World's Fair in Chicago in the late 19th century, and he's putting the elevator brake on display. Because imagine, who are the first people who are going to get on an elevator on a 20-story building, right? Imagine being the first people to test drive an elevator. How do you know it's going to stop? So he builds a 20-story platform that's transparent. He gets up into the elevator where the entire crowd of the World's Fair can see him. And he's a real theater guy. He's got a little bit of P.T. Barnum in him. So what he does is he has a man dressed up as if he's in the gallows with the hood on, and there's a rope, and he's got this knife, and he cuts the rope, and suddenly this elevator just drops fast, 20 stories, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, and the audience is hushed. And right there at about floor 4, it starts to slow. And by the time it comes to the ground, it is stalled and is stopped. And there is Otis, alive and well, smiling and championing and selling what would ultimately become something that is in every elevator still to this day. You'll see the name Otis there, right? Well, and by the way, we make note that in a city like New York, the miles of elevator shafts are longer than the miles of subway tunnels.
Wow, no kidding.
Now it's
And where do we see Otis? Because everybody's going to go into an elevator after watching this is going to look for it. Where do they see it?
it'll be a stamp somewhere on the elevator, and it'll be a metal stamp. It'll be a metal part of the elevator, and that's his technology. It's the company's technology.
That is amazing, and I love the fact that you tell. Because again, I mean, you might. Oh, this is really good if you're playing Trivial Pursuit someday. Does anybody still play that? By the way, in the era of online games.
Google ruined it.
Yeah, I think they kind of did. But anyway, I love that, and I love knowing those kinds of things. I'm an origin guy. It's one of the reasons I was drawn to your series, Lee. Honestly, is my kids make fun of me anytime there's a word like I don't even know what was the most recent one we were talking about over the weekend. I can't remember what it was, but I literally said, "What's the origin of that? Who decided that's what that's called?" And I do that all the time, and they say, "I don't know," and I look, but that's what we get here. That's what you're giving the origin of things. Look at the categories. Go ahead and throw that up on the screen. Look at some of the categories that you guys have for your episodes: entertainment, technology, inventions, obviously, military. There's a story that I saw that you guys did. It's one of the more recent ones on an Army Ranger turned Border Patrol agent, Vincent Rocco Vargas. Now, this is just a guy who happened to be an American hero simply for joining the Army and becoming a Ranger. That's an elite special forces unit guy. He retires from the Army and now says, "I'm going to serve my country by protecting its border." Nobody knows this guy the way they know some of the names that you just did, but you give life to his story here, Lee, and I just think that's extraordinary.
Yeah, we love to do that during National Police Week. We tell the stories of the fallen cops from the year of. That's one of the only current events kind of stories we do, and we generally now are playing the eulogies of a family member. So if a family member sends us a eulogy, we play it, and we love. By the way, we love playing eulogies, and we've played a bunch over the years. Jack Nicklaus's eulogy for Arnold Palmer, we play every year on the day that Arnold Palmer died, because what Arnold Palmer did for golf, and I'm not a golfer, but I had no idea that Arnold Palmer was the man who democratized golf, who made golf a sport that everyone thought they could play. And more importantly, Arnold Palmer was the founder of IMG. He was the first person to say, we golfers need an agent. Heck, we athletes need an agent. He had gone in to see the head of Wilson Sporting Goods. He was winning championships. Back then, golfers didn't get paid millions. Golfers didn't even get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for winning tournaments, nor did pro football players, pro basketball players. This is recent. The guys like Arnold Palmer were always hustling. He went in to see the president of Wilson Sporting Goods, where he had the prime sponsorship, and he asked for a raise. And the head of Wilson Sporting Goods said, no golfer's going to make more money than the head of Wilson Sporting Goods. Arnold Palmer walked out, called a lawyer friend Mark McCormick, and started IMG. Arnold would become a designer of golf courses, design his own line of clothing and golf clubs, and now there's no athlete in America who doesn't own their independence and wealth to this guy called Arnie.
Wow, I never knew that about him. When you say he democratized golf and made it so that everyone could play, what do you mean?
Well, he didn't. First of all, he wasn't this big, tall, gaping athlete like Jack Nicklaus. He was a little shorter. It didn't have that big swing, but it was how he played the game, how he spoke. He didn't seem like he was born from blue bloods because he wasn't. In the end, golf used to be sort of a rich kid's game. Nobody I knew golfed who didn't have money. How did you get on the course? How did you learn how to play? And Arnold did one other thing in terms of democratizing the sport. He would shake everybody's hand. He was of the people and by the people and spoke the people's language when he would talk about or be interviewed about his life and about the sport of golf. And so the ordinary kid watching will go, wow, Arnie did it. I can do it. I'll get a pair of clubs, a used pair of clubs, and I'll go to the public course. Or I'll go out to not even a driving range. I'll just go out into a field and I'll shag some balls. And so, the way that Arnold Palmer talked about his family and the fact that he became a first class pilot so he could get back to his home in Latrobe in Pennsylvania. I mean, there were so many things we learned about Arnold Palmer. My favorite was what his grandson said. His grandson eulogized Arnold Palmer after Nicholas. And I was wondering, wow, how do you follow Jack? But I realized that Jack didn't want to follow the grandson. So the grandson tells a story. And he said, anybody who knows Gramps knows his nickname was Grumps and Grumpy. And so one day Grumps is calling me and he calls me and says, where are you? And I said, well, Dad, I'm home with the kids. And he goes, well, you should be out playing golf, damn it. You got to be able to feed those kids. About a month later, I call and I say, Gramps, Gramps calls and he says, where are you? And I go, well, I'm out on the course, Dad. I'm trying to make a living for the kids. He goes, you shouldn't stay out on that course too long. You got to take care of your family. And he goes, and that was Gramps. He was always pushing me to be a better father and a better golfer and to balance the two. But he said, but my favorite call, one day I call him and my Gramps, unless he was playing golf, always answered my calls within 2 calls. And he answers and he says, hey, look, I don't have much time. I'm with the president. And the grandson said, the president of what, Grumps? And he said, the president of the United States. Hold on a second. And he hands the phone to the president of the United States, introduces him to his grandson. And he said, I learned right there that no matter what was happening in the world, I was one of the most important people in the world to my grandfather. And my goodness, that taught me something about when my daughter would call. And those are the things we really like to try and dig into. How can we, the power of a story is not only that we can step into it and see ourselves, right? I think this has always been the power of Bible stories. Am I Cain or am I Abel? Who do I want to be, right? In the prodigal son story, do I want to be the son who comes back and having squandered the family fortune or not? And if the son does come back, do I want to be that brother who's jealous because the father's throwing this repentant son a party? Do I want to be that jerk? Or do I want to welcome my brother back who made some mistakes and give him a second chance? And what we love really about our stories is its imitative power. We want to imitate heroes in our life. We want to be a little more like them. Well, what got them to be them? What made them who they were? What were choices in their life and character attributes in their life that made them the people they were? So that's what's interesting about us is the story behind the story. You may think you know X, but we're going to tell you the story behind, even as we pointed out earlier, songs we all know. My favorite song story of all time was God Bless America by Irving Berlin. I mean, it has a remarkable history. And Berlin's love of this country was unadulterated because, his family escaped pogroms in Russia. And for people who don't know what pogroms were, we just experienced one on 10/7 of last year. This is when Jews are killed for being Jews. And this was happening across Russia at the time in the late 19th century. So his father leaves with the last memory being of him and his family watching the house burn to the ground in Russia because they were Jewish. And he comes to the Lower East Side with nothing, and his father dies when he's 8 years old. He becomes the head of the household. And he starts singing at tables, at waiting tables and singing at tables for a dime. And it turns out he's got a talent for melody. He teaches himself how to play music. He can't read music at any point in time in his life. And the only keys on the keyboard he can play are the black ones because he had short, stubby fingers. So he learned how to transpose by getting transposing pianos made that could turn those discordant F chords, those sharp chords, into diminished chords, major chords, or any other kind of chord. But he wrote God Bless America in 1918. He was about to go serve in World War One. The song didn't have any buyers. He put it in a drawer, but he felt the storm clouds rising in 38 and 39. And Hitler was making his move throughout Europe. And in Berlin's mind, it was just a matter of time. He knew a lot of Jews in Europe, and he was sort of getting the same kind of inside information about the Nazis that the great Winston Churchill had, because Winston had so many great Jewish friends. And so he takes God Bless America out of the drawer. Kate Smith records it, and the rest is history. And his daughter would later say, this was the land he loved. This was his home sweet home. And in the end, he donated every penny, and it was tens of millions of dollars of royalties to the Boys Club of America. And what's fascinating about Berlin is The Man from Russia also wrote another hit as well. The Man from Russia wrote God Bless America, and a man who was Jewish wrote White Christmas. And he was the same guy, right? So a Jew writes White Christmas, a Russian writes God Bless America, and he happens to be the same man. And he also writes 1,500 other songs, America's songbook, essentially, or Irving Berlin wrote. And all this coming with a history of the worst kind of discrimination, the absolute worst kind of tragedy and history you could have. And this is the thing we really try and get at most. You know, my dad would always bring Holocaust survivors into his school because he taught in a district where a lot of kids thought they had sad stories. And by the way, they surely did. But he wanted to let them know through these stories of older people that there's no tragedy you can't get through if you try to. But if you allow the tragedy to define you, to become a professional victim, then that's all you'll have is your victimology, and you will not have a life. And so I watched my dad bring in people like this to tell stories to gymnasiums filled with kids who would have a very hard time after hearing these stories, even thinking about whining about their current situation. And again, this is the other power of storytelling. If a guy can overcome being in Auschwitz, have his family murdered, and thrive in the United States despite rampant discrimination, then please tell me there's more to what's holding you back than the fact that this is a, quote, white supremacist nation. Because Lebanese people have been discriminated against, and Italians got discriminated against. We were called wops and guineas and dagos,
Sure.
and Italians were Catholics. But you know what? Italians, my grandfather was like, okay, you guinea, or you that. He would just mock them back. And then the next thing you know, they're drinking in bars together, eating each other's restaurants, and sharing a life together. And yeah, it was a little rough, and yeah, there were some times where we fought, but in the end, we got over these things. We didn't litigate these matters. We didn't try and separate ourselves. And on July 4th, and on these big American celebration days, these streets, my parents grew up in West New York, New Jersey, which is right across the river from New York City. And all these immigrants were crammed into 5-story walk-ups, Poles next to Italians, next to Greeks, next to Jews, and it's all different, but all loving and wanting the same things for their kids, which is a better life and a good life. And America was the channel through which all of these people rested their hopes. And we've lost that in large measure in a lot of our dialogue. And I've watched conservatives not talk humanely about their opponents. I've watched progressives talk inhumanely about their ideological opponents. And on this show, we just don't do that. We may disagree, but we don't have to be disagreeable. And we certainly shouldn't hate people we disagree with. It's not the American way. It's not the way to progress as a country. And if there is a story that stood out as a symbol of that, or two, the two were David Goldberger of the ACLU, who in the late 1970s was a Jewish head of the Jewish chapter of the ACLU, and a neo-Nazi came in, and he wanted to have marching permits for the city of Chicago, and Mayor Daley was giving him a hard time. And so he said, well, I'd like to maybe do Skokie instead. Turns out there are a lot of Jewish Holocaust survivors there. We can get a lot of press. Well, what do you know? David Goldberg represents these neo-Nazis. And David Goldberger is a Jew himself. And he gets a lot of dissent from his Jewish peers. There were some synagogues who really attacked him. And Goldberger asked for entry into those synagogues because he wanted to explain his position. He wasn't there, he told them, because he was defending neo-Nazis. He was there because he was defending the First Amendment. And then we had to defend the most vile speech and the speech of our opponents because it could be us next. And we had to defend the principle of free speech and not the person. And this was something that Americans used to rally around too, this idea that I may not agree with you, but I'm going to fight to the end of my life your right to speak it. And I'll be on the other side of that street holding up my sign in radical disagreement. And that was the American spirit of agreeing to disagree and even fighting for the rights of someone you don't like. And of course, he said that his hero was John Adams, who defended the Redcoats in the Boston Massacre. And he was the only Boston lawyer who did it.
So in today's digital sphere of discussion and debate, it's not about one side of the street and hold up a sign and you're on the other side holding up a sign disagreeing with you, but I'll defend your right to say it. It's the exact opposite. In today's digital public square, if you disagree with me, I'm silencing you. I don't want to hear it. I'm canceling it. I am suppressing it. I am asking the moderators to spike it, get rid of it. The only way we're going to come to an agreement here is if you disappear and only people can hear my voice. Big, big change. How is this part of America's story going to be told?
That's an interesting thing. We're skipping the sociological aspects for now. We like to be at least 20 or 30 years removed from something to figure out what the real change is. Because sometimes, a country will adopt something and pretty quickly realize, this isn't worth adopting. We better watch how we use this technology. I don't know a parent now who's not rethinking how to think about social media use with their kids, right?
Yeah.
We've seen suicide rates, double. Our kids are lonelier than ever because their heads are buried in a phone. And my goodness, I watch adults' heads buried in phones too. So this is something we're going to have to work out.
State of Florida just recently passed a law outlawing social media use for kids under 14. All period. You can't do it. You can't have an account. And if it's 14 or 15, you have to have parent permission. I don't know how they're going to enforce it, but that's how dangerous and desperate it's become.
Well, but that look, I hate to admit this, but our audience, our age will know it. There was a time when you could drink and drive. People did it all the time. And I don't talk about designated drivers, and no one did blow tests unless you killed somebody. But there came a day where a campaign started. It was Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And one day it was talk, and one day it was social pressure, and the next thing you know, laws passed. Now, did it stop all drunk driving? Of course not. But the social mores changed. Look, I was a kid who grew up during the Woodstock era, and there was some good things about the Woodstock era. I liked some of the music. But my goodness, when people started saying, call me by my first name, adults, or yeah, you can date my daughter and you can make out with her in the basement, and here's some booze and here's some pot. No, sir, no, thank you, right? And so my generation voted 61%, 21 and under, for Ronald Reagan. This shocked the New York Times. Like, how could these kids have done this when their parents were the Woodstock generation, right? Well, things change.
Good question.
Things change, and they change all the time. The Irish vote used to be a 90% Democrat vote. No one even talks about the Irish vote anymore because there's no such thing. The Irish now vote on the candidate and their own personal preferences. It's probably split right up the middle. A good thing, right? Because it's no longer tribalism. It's no longer my vote's permanently affiliated with that party. It won't work well for you in the end anyway when you currently affix your vote to a party, because that party will then come to abuse your vote because they'll think they have it in the bag. They won't think they have to earn it. So, what's interesting about America is many of our battles have been happening since the beginning. The most epic of all the battles has always been the rural versus the city. This was Jefferson versus Hamilton, right? And Jefferson hated Hamilton because he saw Hamilton as a creature of the ever-expanding federal government, big banks, big cities. Jefferson, when he became president, who deplored executive power, thought it could be turned into a monarchy, the presidency, used his executive power to do what? To do the biggest land grab in American history so there could be more rural spaces. Because he wanted to make sure that the balance of power between small states and big states, between rural America and city America, were balanced out. Well, you take a look at a voting map today, and everybody thinks it's Trump and it's this. No. Rural people vote one way because of where and how they live. And city people vote another way because of where and how they live. This has been happening since the beginning of time in this country, and it's not a bad thing. The dynamic tension between the rural and the cities is a fundamental and beautiful part of American life. You can choose to live in either. Many Americans like me grew up near a big city and now live in a more rural part of America. So the choice is ours. We get to vote with our feet. The state of Florida had 9 electoral votes in 1960. It now is approaching 45. New York State used to have 45 electoral votes in 1960. They're approaching 25. So that means that New York has lost a huge part of its population in comparison to Florida, which has gained a huge population because people are voting not D or R, they're voting based on the state policies and where they'd rather put their capital. And not just their money capital, I'm talking about their social capital, their families, their churches, their lives. And that movement of social capital, this whole idea of a federal republic, and it's a constitutional republic. America is not a democracy. We repeat over and over again in our storytelling that this is not a democracy. In fact, it's a very anti-democratic country when it comes to the Bill of Rights. Every American could get together tomorrow and say there's no longer a right to practice your religion. Would get turned down by the Supreme Court 9-0. Because now those Bill of Rights are there to protect our liberties, our God-given liberties, from the mob, from the majority. Thank goodness, because the majority can be wrong, and so we have
Absolutely.
and we have this counter-majoritarian part of our Constitution. Then we also have all of this separation of powers, right? We have one branch that is elected every 2 years, another branch of the legislature is every 6. Then we have an independent executive branch, unlike Europe, where the prime ministers are a creature of the legislative branch. And then we have this independent judiciary. And then underneath that are the states. Within the states are the counties. Within the counties are the mayoralties and municipalities. And then all of the churches, all these civic organizations. And that dispersal of power is the beauty and the power of this country. You can try and accumulate all the power you'd like. You do so at your own peril. And I believe that's in private companies too. We're about to do the story about the foundational story of a Microsoft, which is now the number one capitalized company in America, a $3 trillion company that most Americans own in their stock portfolios. Well, what happened is a young Bill Gates went to IBM back in the day when IBM dominated the mainframe computer business. And he was, as a young man, trying to let him know that the software he created was going to revolutionize the computer market and make Apple or Windows and the personal computer be the dominant mode of computing. And the computing power was going to increase exponentially till one day those mainframes would be rendered meaningless. Well, IBM stuck to its guns. They had a monopoly on mainframe computers. 20 years later, Bill Gates had a higher market cap than the almighty IBM. And now IBM is out of the top 50 and Microsoft's number 1. So watch out, big fella, because there's a little guy coming after you. And if you neglect your customers, if you stop serving good meals at your local restaurant, if you start taking your customers for granted, if you stop practicing your foul shots in basketball, you're not entitled to another NBA contract, let alone for my family to come to your restaurant again. This is the joy of free market capitalism. It creates voluntarism, it creates excellence, it creates accountability, and all without anybody doing anything to anybody. And the biggest thing it creates is this idea that all of these folks that would go to my grandfather's pizzeria were Poles, they were black, they were white, and they were eating Italian food. My grandfather was making a profit and feeding his family from people, many of whom didn't even like Italians, but they loved Italian food. And that's what he would always say. I don't care if they like me. If they like my pizza, they like me. And I went, my goodness, I wish we could all be that less sensitive about everything around us and stick to what we're supposed to be doing, which is take care of our families and get good at our craft. If we love our God, love our neighbor as ourselves, and be the Christians, Jews, Muslims that God wanted us to be.
Lee, I've only got a couple of minutes left here. And most of everything we've talked about thus far has been historic. Our American Stories is our American history. But I'm going to ask you to crystal ball this now. 20 years from now, 25 years from now, if you or anybody else is still doing Our American Stories, looking back to this era, let's say the early 20s, name one or two people or things that you're going to do an episode about that has to be told.
That is fascinating. It's so hard to know, right? Who the people of courage will be, because they just step up. If in 1938 you had said Churchill, people would have laughed you out of the joint. You
Good
can't
point.
know until you know, right? Everybody talks a good game. The question is who's got the game. And so in my mind, we don't know, because, and that's why a guy like David McCullough, we've done quite a number of hours using his voice. It always likes to say, like, I don't like to write about history until it's 30 years out, because no one knows what's going to happen. So I wish I could say that there might be something in AI.
We know there are some things that are being done right now that are historic. I'm glad you mentioned AI, because I was going to say Elon Musk. Elon Musk has transformed media, transformed internet, social media, and yeah, between, and not always in a great way. You talk about transhumanism and Neuralinks being put into brains and so on and so forth, and the advent of AI. This is a historic time for him and what he is doing, and I feel like 30 years from now, when these stories are told, that's got to be one.
I couldn't agree more. And these are not perfect people.
No.
The guy who transformed the 20th century in many ways, Henry Ford, was a rabid anti-Semite and had views about race that were just really oddball. Eugenics being an idea that was rampant in the early 20th centuries among intellectuals, and even at the greatest institutions in America, and straight up to a president of ours believing in eugenics. Woodrow Wilson believed in this stuff because it was the science of the day. It was the consensus. But Ford was also a genius.
That story needs to be told, though, right? I mean, it doesn't have to be glorified, doesn't have to be told in a positive way, but the reality of it has to be told. It's the same thing with Donald Trump. You may love Donald Trump and think he's the savior of the country, against all of this radical progressivism, or you may think that he's the new age Hitler. Either way, that story is going to be told, and probably a dozen different ways. And I wonder how it'll be told. If somebody can do it without the thumb on the scale like you guys do, I wonder how our American story, Trump style, will be told.
We will see. Henry Ford's the plants that he builds end up building the modern warships, airplanes that would free the Jews from the death camps. Call that irony. Call it what you want, right? But capitalism won World War II, not just the bravery of our soldiers. Capitalism helped win World War II. Now, you may not like capitalism, but at its peak, Willow Run, the plant that Ford created, Willow Run, one assembly plant, was churning out of its plant one B-24 Liberator every minute, 6,000 of them. Nice advantage for America compared to the, quote, industrial power of Russia and or Germany, because our industrial power dwarfed theirs and England's combined.
Well, I'll tell you what, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm a fan, and I want everybody, the website is there on the screen right now, ouramericanstories.com. You've got obviously Facebook pages, you've got your podcast. Anywhere else you want people to know where to find you and the stories?
The easiest thing to do is if you've got a podcast, Apple, iHeart Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, we do 5 stories a day. So 5 stories a day from contributors all around the country, historians all around the country. They know our format. They know what we want. We just curate, approve, and then organize them. So if you want something fun, there's something fun. You want something deep, you want something about faith, we try to mix it up every day. So there's something for everyone each and every day on the Our American Stories podcast.
Well, I'm glad I found you. Lee Habeeb, thank you for what you've created. Thank you for what you continue to do. You've got a great team, and you've got a great product, and obviously a great vision. We appreciate you sharing it with us.
Thanks so much. Thanks.
Like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to be notified for all our new videos. New episodes dropping every Tuesday morning, and we'll have some of our favorite interviews from the vault dropping on Fridays as well.